In chapters 8 and 10, Aristotle turns his attention briefly to monarchy or tyranny, but he hastens on to a comparison of the different political models that he's sketched. After reviewing the different forms of government, democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, Aristotle now in chapter 11 gives a critical evaluation of them in order to determine which is the best. His strategy is to combine the best elements of the different systems. Thus, the best form of government is not one that insists exclusively on the one principle or the other, but instead strikes the right balance between the different principles. This is an extension of Aristotle's conception of the virtuous character, that which follows a middle path or golden mean between two extremes that we've discussed before. Just as was the case for the individual, so also the state should seek moderation or sophrosune in its political construction. Aristotle refers directly to his account of this in the Nicomachean Ethics. Quote, "If it was correctly said in the discourses on ethics that the happy life is one in accord with virtue and unimpeded, and the virtue is a mean, then the middling sort of life is best, the mean that is capable of being attained by each sort of individual." These same defining principles must also define virtue and vice in the case of a city and a regime. End quote. With regard to the constitution of the population of the city, there are people who have very little, those who have some, and those who have a lot. For Aristotle, once again, the extremes are problematic. People who are very rich, he says, have a tendency to be arrogant and condescending. By contrast, people who are very poor, he says, have a tendency to be base and petty. These foibles render it impossible for either of these two groups to be effective as leaders or civic-minded citizens. The rich are too arrogant to listen to others and thus to take into account their views. By contrast, the poor are too humble and are unable to take the needed initiative to rule effectively. The goal is to aim for the middle. The best state is one that has a large population of people who are neither rich nor poor, but find themselves somewhere in the middle. Aristotle believes that this is the best way to avoid the factionalism that one finds too often in different forms of government. Since the vast majority of people will be neither rich nor poor, their common interests will serve to allow the political discussion to gravitate towards the center. While there will always be extreme views, on this model, they will not have so many proponents and thus will pose no threat to the stability of the state. Here we can see again the Greek concept of balance that we discussed above. The state contains many different elements, and the best form of government is the one that keeps these in correct proportion in order to make use of the advantages that each political system offers. Thus, problems arise when the balance is lost. When the democratic principle is regarded as absolute, this leads to the tyranny of the masses and to a political instability, since the mob is at the mercy of the populists. Likewise, when the oligarchic principle is regarded as absolute, this too leads to problems, since it can lead to the tyranny of a political elite which works only to further its own particular interests. With respect to the idea of following the golden mean in government, Aristotle also has in mind a kind of mixture of different political principles. In a democracy, all free men are able to participate in the assembly. In an oligarchy, a qualification of land or property makes it such that only a small select group can participate. Aristotle suggests that these two principles can be combined. One way of doing this would be the division of powers in government. For example, in Great Britain, the government is shared by the House of Lords, which represents the aristocratic model, and the House of Commons, which represents the democratic one. The key is that both elements are present as constitutive parts of the political structure, thus representing both sets of interests. Another way of doing this would be to agree upon a golden mean with respect to the required qualifications, such that it's not completely negligible, thus allowing for everyone to participate, but at the same time not so rigorous that it is highly exclusive. Aristotle also mentions that in democracies, some positions are chosen by lot, whereas in aristocracies, they're distributed by election. The implication is that with a mixed government, there would be instances of both of these principles, with some offices being allocated in the democratic way and others the aristocratic way. When the correct mixture has been achieved, it would then be possible to refer to the given state as either democratic or oligarchical, depending on which elements are at issue. Aristotle notes that, for example, the government of Sparta is alternatively designated as both democracy and oligarchy. The key is to remain in the ambiguity and to foster a healthy pluralism of political institutions and forums. Usually, when we think of the golden mean, we believe that this means to avoid either extreme. But interestingly, Aristotle claims that the correct balance means preserving elements of the extremes which complement each other. Thus, instead of the extremes being eliminated by the mean, they are in fact revealed in it. This is what some philosophers call a dialectical relation, that is, one where opposites are not conceived as exclusive, but rather as complementary. It's interesting that although both Plato and Aristotle had such extensive first-hand experience with the celebrated Athenian democracy, they both rejected it as the best form of government. They both see certain advantages in a more aristocratic approach. But with this said, when Aristotle continues his discussion of the best form of government in Books 7 and 8, he does claim that the ideal is a constitution that allows for the equality of citizens with respect to their moral capacities.